Hello there, and welcome to this gentle journey through the deepest story ever told. I'm so glad you found your way here tonight. Perhaps you've had one of those days where the present moment feels overwhelming, or maybe you're someone who finds peace in contemplating the vast tapestry of time rather than the worries of tomorrow. Either way, this evening's voyage is for you. You have nothing to do but rest. Let your breathing slow, your thoughts settle, and your body sink into comfort, as if the very atoms that compose you remember their ancient origins. Because tonight, we're not simply learning about the past. We're traveling through your own story, tracing the unbroken chain that connects you to the very first spark of life on Earth. We'll drift gently through 4 billion years of patient transformation, from the cooling of a molten world to the emergence of consciousness itself. You'll hear of ancient seas that brewed the chemistry of life, of tiny organisms that learned to capture sunlight, and of the great innovations that built the foundation upon which all complex life, including you, would eventually stand. This is the story of how matter learned to live, how chemistry became biology, and how, over unimaginable spans of time, the universe found a way to know itself through your very existence. Some of what you hear tonight may surprise you. Some may fill you with wonder. And some may simply carry you toward peaceful rest. All of it will remind you that you are part of something magnificent and ancient. If these quiet explorations through deep time help you find peace at the end of your day, know that you're participating in something beautiful. You're allowing your consciousness to touch the edges of the greatest story ever unfolded. Now, let's begin. 4.5 billion years ago, Earth was not the blue marble of life we know today. It was a world reborn from violence, still glowing with the heat of its own traumatic creation. The giant impact that carved away a piece of our planet to become the moon had left Earth molten and seething, a ball of liquid rock spinning rapidly through the darkness of space. But even in this hellish landscape, the patient work of becoming was already underway. Slowly, so slowly that no single human lifetime could perceive the change, Earth began to cool. Steam rose from cooling rock in vast clouds that wrapped the planet in a thick, turbulent atmosphere. The very air, if you could call it that, was a choking mixture of carbon dioxide, methane, water vapor, and ammonia. No creature from our world could have drawn a single breath and survived. Yet there was a strange beauty in this alien Earth. The day lasted only 6 hours because the moon hung so close that it appeared 20 times larger than it does today, dominating the sky like a great orange eye. The tidal forces between these two gravitational dancers created waves over 1,000 feet tall that crashed endlessly against scattered volcanic islands. Lightning split the sky almost constantly, illuminating the thick atmosphere with an endless electrical storm that would have dwarfed any hurricane our modern world has ever seen. The greenhouse effect was 100 times stronger than today, trapping heat so efficiently that even as the planet cooled, surface temperatures remained hot enough to brew tea, around 70 degrees Celsius. In this primordial world, spinning so fast that a year contained over 1,400 days, something extraordinary was happening. Comets and asteroids, those wandering messengers from the outer solar system, were delivering precious cargo. Each impact brought water, locked in ice, complex carbon compounds, and the chemical building blocks that would prove essential for life. As millions of years passed, the steam finally began to condense. The first raindrops to fall on Earth were acidic, carrying volcanic gases that would have burned any modern life form. But they fell nonetheless, and gradually, patiently, they began to fill the low places of the world. The iron dissolved in these early oceans turned them the color of rust, nothing like the blue seas we know today. These were the oceans of possibility, hot and mineral-rich, stretched across most of the planet's surface, with only scattered volcanic islands breaking the waves. The chemistry within them was unlike anything that exists today. Yet somewhere in their warm depths, in ways we're still trying to understand, the boundary between chemistry and life was about to be crossed for the first time. The transition from lifeless chemistry to living biology remains one of the most profound mysteries in science. Yet somehow, in those ancient, rust-colored seas, or perhaps around the warm volcanic vents that dotted the ocean floor, the impossible happened. Matter learned to copy itself. Picture those early oceans, warmed by volcanic heat and stirred by tremendous tides. In sheltered pools or around hydrothermal vents, glowing with mineral-rich water, complex organic molecules were forming and breaking apart in an endless dance of chemical possibility. Carbon bonded with hydrogen, nitrogen found sulfur, and in countless trillions of random encounters, the first self-replicating molecules appeared. These weren't living things as we understand them. They were probably not much larger than modern viruses, simple chains of RNA that had stumbled upon the remarkable ability to make copies of themselves. RNA, that humble cousin of DNA, could both store information and catalyze chemical reactions. It was the first molecular Swiss Army knife, capable of being both the recipe and the chef. The first life forms were tougher than anything alive today. They had to be. They could survive being frozen solid in the cold of space or boiled in volcanic heat. Some may have glowed with their own ethereal bioluminescence, tiny sparks of light in the darkness of the deep ocean. They fed not on sunlight, which was 25% dimmer than today, but on hydrogen, sulfide gas belching from underwater volcanoes. These pioneer organisms lived in complete darkness, in a world that would have been instantly lethal to any modern form of life. Yet they persisted, reproduced, and gradually began to explore the chemical possibilities of their environment. Some learned to build primitive cell membranes from soap-like molecules that may have arrived on meteorites. Others developed simple ways to sense their chemical surroundings. Life during this era was fragile and may have been wiped out completely several times by giant asteroid impacts that boiled away the oceans and sterilized the surface. But somehow, somewhere, the spark of life persisted. In the patient arithmetic of deep time, these simple chemical systems were writing the first chapters of the story that would eventually lead to you. As you rest tonight, remember that the chemistry of your own body still carries echoes of those ancient seas. The salt in your blood, the carbon in your bones, the very water that comprises most of your being. All of it traces back to those first warm pools where chemistry learned to live. For nearly 1 billion years, life remained simple and small. But then, around 3.5 billion years ago, something revolutionary happened. Life learned to eat sunlight. The inventors of this world-changing technology were cyanobacteria, tiny organisms that discovered how to capture the energy streaming down from the sun and use it to power their own growth. They were the world's first solar panels, and their innovation would transform not just life, but the entire planet. These remarkable bacteria began to form the first biological communities, spreading across shallow seas in layered mats that built upward toward the light. Some of these stromatolites, as we call them today, grew to be over 100 feet tall. Earth's first cities, built by living things rather than geology. The cyanobacteria were innovators in ways that still amaze us. They were the first organisms to develop true sight, using primitive light-sensing abilities to track the daily movement of the sun. They were among the first to evolve a biological immune system. And most remarkably, they invented a 2-step process of photosynthesis that every plant on Earth still uses today. But their greatest innovation was also their most dangerous. As they captured sunlight and split water molecules to fuel their growth, they released a waste product that began to accumulate in the atmosphere. That waste product was oxygen, and for most life on Earth, it was a deadly poison. Watch the ancient oceans as these bacterial communities spread. Oxygen bubbles rise from countless microscopic factories, each one a tiny rebel against the established order of an oxygen-free world. The bacteria themselves didn't know they were participating in a planetary revolution. They were simply living, growing, reproducing, following the patient chemistry that had been refined over hundreds of millions of years. Some species learned to fix nitrogen directly from the air, becoming living fertilizer factories that enriched their communities. Others developed the first biological timekeepers, internal clocks that allowed them to anticipate the daily rising and setting of the sun. These ancient bacteria were forming cooperative networks, sharing resources and information in ways that prefigured all the complex partnerships that would follow. As oxygen levels slowly rose in the atmosphere and oceans, the character of the seas began to change. The rust-red color caused by dissolved iron gradually gave way to clearer waters as the iron oxidized and settled to the ocean floor. The sky itself began to take on a different hue as oxygen molecules in the upper atmosphere started forming the first hints of an ozone layer. The cyanobacteria continue their ancient work today. Every fifth breath you take contains oxygen produced by the descendants of these pioneering organisms. They still form living mats in certain parts of the world, patient communities that have been perfecting their solar technology for billions of years. These tiny organisms changed everything. They proved that life could not only adapt to its environment, but fundamentally alter it. The oxygen they produced as waste would soon become the foundation for entirely new forms of life, including the complex cellular machinery that powers your own body. The accumulation of oxygen in Earth's atmosphere represented the first great environmental crisis in the history of life. For most organisms that had evolved over the previous billion years, oxygen was a toxic poison that destroyed their cellular machinery and threatened their very existence. This was the Great Oxidation Event, sometimes called the Oxygen Catastrophe, or even the Oxygen Holocaust. It sounds dramatic, and it was. Oxygen was so reactive that it literally rusted the iron dissolved in the oceans, creating the distinctive banded iron formations that geologists still study today. These geological layers tell the story of a planet in transition, recording the gradual rise of a gas that would reshape the world. The crisis unfolded slowly by human standards, but rapidly in geological time. It took approximately 300 million years for oxygen levels to stabilize. And during this period, most of the life forms that had dominated Earth simply vanished. Entire lineages of bacteria that had thrived for hundreds of millions of years retreated to the depths of the ocean or disappeared entirely. But crisis often drives innovation, and the organisms that survived this chemical transformation evolved remarkable new abilities. They learned to produce antioxidants, molecular bodyguards that could protect their cells from oxygen damage. Some developed sophisticated ways to neutralize the reactive oxygen species that could tear apart their DNA and proteins. Most importantly, some organisms learned to not just tolerate oxygen, but to use it. They discovered that oxygen could be used in cellular respiration to produce energy far more efficiently than any previous method. An oxygen-breathing organism could generate 18 times more energy than its anaerobic cousins. This was like discovering a new fuel that made everything faster, stronger, and more complex. The rising oxygen levels also triggered Earth's first major ice age. Oxygen destroyed the methane in the atmosphere that had been acting as a greenhouse gas, allowing the planet to cool dramatically. Ice sheets spread across continents, and the climate became more variable and challenging. But oxygen also provided an unexpected gift. High in the atmosphere, oxygen molecules began to form ozone, a 3-atom version of the gas that could absorb the deadly ultraviolet radiation streaming down from the sun. For the first time in Earth's history, life gained protection from one of the most dangerous forms of cosmic radiation. Some organisms chose a different survival strategy. They retreated to the deep ocean vents and oxygen-free sediments, where they could continue their ancient way of life. Remarkably, many of these anaerobic bacteria still exist today. Living fossils that preserve the lifestyle of Earth's earliest inhabitants. The Great Oxidation Event was the first time that life fundamentally changed the composition of Earth's entire atmosphere. It established a precedent that life would follow throughout its history. The principle that living things don't just respond to their environment, but actively reshape it. The oxygen you breathe today is a direct legacy of this ancient crisis, a reminder that even the air around you has a history stretching back billions of years. 2 billion years ago, life achieved perhaps its greatest innovation yet. In an event so unlikely that it has only happened once in the entire history of our planet, one type of bacteria learned to live inside another, creating the first complex cells with internal structures. This process, called endosymbiosis, began when larger bacteria started engulfing smaller ones. Instead of digesting their captives, some of these bacterial partnerships discovered that they could live together, each partner contributing something essential to their shared survival. The smaller bacteria became permanent residents, evolving into the specialized structures we now call organelles. The most important of these partnerships created mitochondria, the powerhouses that provide energy to every complex cell on Earth, including every cell in your body. The bacteria that became mitochondria brought with them the sophisticated machinery needed to use oxygen for energy production. They had already mastered the dangerous art of oxygen breathing, and now they shared this technology with their larger partners. Your cells today contain hundreds of mitochondria, each one a descendant of those ancient bacterial partners. Each mitochondrion still carries its own DNA, separate from the DNA in your cell nucleus, a genetic signature that proves its bacterial ancestry. Remarkably, mitochondrial DNA is inherited only from mothers, creating an unbroken maternal lineage stretching back 2 billion years. In plant cells, a similar partnership occurred with cyanobacteria, the same organisms that had first learned to capture sunlight. These became chloroplasts, the green structures that allow plants to photosynthesize. Every leaf, every blade of grass, every tree contains billions of these descendants of ancient bacteria, still faithfully converting sunlight into chemical energy. The creation of complex cells was revolutionary because it allowed life to become much larger and more sophisticated. Eukaryotic cells, as these complex cells are called, are 10,000 times larger than their bacterial ancestors. They could accommodate much more genetic material and support much more complex internal machinery. The cell nucleus itself probably evolved as a protective vault for DNA, keeping the precious genetic information safe from the oxidizing effects of the oxygen-rich environment. This innovation allowed cells to maintain much larger genomes and experiment with more complex forms of organization. Some single-celled organisms today are actually more complex than the earliest animals that would evolve millions of years later. They can hunt, build temporary structures, communicate with each other, and even display primitive forms of learning and memory. This cellular cooperation also introduced the concept of programmed cell death. For the first time, individual cells learned to sacrifice themselves for the benefit of the larger organism. This seemingly paradoxical innovation, death in service of life, would become essential for all complex multicellular organisms, including you. The partnership between different types of cells that created eukaryotes represents one of the most important mergers in the history of life. It proved that cooperation could be just as powerful as competition in driving evolution. The complex machinery of your own cells is a living testament to the power of ancient partnerships that learned to work together toward common goals. 1 billion years ago, life took another momentous step. Individual cells, which had been living independently for over 2 billion years, began to stick together in permanent partnerships. This marked the beginning of multicellular life, communities of cells that could work together to achieve things that no single cell could accomplish alone. The first multicellular organisms were probably similar to modern slime molds, collections of individual cells that could come together temporarily when conditions required cooperation, then separate again when independence was more advantageous. But gradually, some of these cellular communities became permanent, with individual cells giving up their freedom for the benefits of group living. This transition required one of the most significant sacrifices in the history of life. Some cells had to give up their ability to reproduce independently, dedicating their existence to supporting the larger community. They became specialized workers, each type of cell developing particular skills that benefited the whole organism. The first multicellular life forms were remarkably simple by modern standards. They had no heads or tails, no fronts or backs, no blood or nervous systems. Many looked like living carpets spread across the seafloor, with individual cells working together to filter food from the water or to respond to changes in their environment. Some of these early experiments in multicellularity were so simple that they could be completely disassembled and would reassemble themselves automatically. If you could take one of these primitive organisms and blend it into individual cells, those cells would find each other and reconstruct the original organism, like a biological jigsaw puzzle putting itself back together. These pioneer multicellular organisms faced a fundamental challenge. How could thousands or millions of individual cells coordinate their activities without any central control system? They solved this through chemical communication, developing molecular languages that allowed cells to signal their needs, share information about the environment, and coordinate their responses to challenges. The transition to multicellularity appears to have occurred independently at least 25 different times in Earth's history, suggesting that it represents a natural tendency for life to experiment with cooperation and specialization. Some of these experiments succeeded and gave rise to all the complex life we see today. Others failed and left no descendants, evolutionary dead ends that remind us how many different paths life has explored. Early multicellular communities were like biological communes, with individual cells sharing resources, dividing labor, and working toward common goals. Some cells became specialized for feeding, others for reproduction, and still others for sensing the environment or providing structural support. The first predators were probably multicellular organisms that learned to hunt single-celled prey. This created the first arms race in the history of life. As prey organisms developed defenses, and predators evolved better hunting strategies. The world was becoming more complex, more dangerous, and more interesting. These simple cellular partnerships laid the foundation for everything that would follow. Every plant, every animal, every complex form of life on Earth today traces its ancestry back to those first brave cells that chose cooperation over independence, community over isolation. 540 million years ago, something extraordinary happened. In a relatively brief period that paleontologists call the Cambrian explosion, complex animal life suddenly appeared in the fossil record with a diversity and sophistication that seems almost magical. It was evolution's greatest creative burst, a time when life experimented with body plans and survival strategies that had never been tried before. The Cambrian seas teemed with creatures that would seem alien to modern eyes. There were animals with 5 eyes and vacuum cleaner mouths, others with grasping arms covered in spikes, and some so bizarre that paleontologists initially couldn't tell which end was the head. More major body plans evolved during this period than exist on Earth today, as if life was trying out every possible way of being a complex animal. The first eyes evolved during this time, and they were remarkable. Some animals developed compound eyes with 30,000 individual lenses, providing vision so sophisticated that no modern animal has surpassed it. Trilobites, those successful arthropods that would dominate the seas for millions of years, even evolved calcite lenses in their eyes, the only animals in Earth's history to use actual minerals for vision, creating eyes that were essentially living optical instruments. The Cambrian explosion was driven partly by an evolutionary arms race between predators and prey. Some of the predators were truly fearsome, 6-foot-long creatures with grasping arms that could seize and manipulate their victims. In response, many animals evolved the first hard shells and protective armor, turning the seafloor into a landscape of living fortresses. The Burgess Shale, one of our best windows into this ancient world, preserves animals so strange they challenge our understanding of what life can become. Opabinia moved through the water with 5 mushroom-shaped eyes and a flexible proboscis tipped with a claw, like something from a fever dream. Hallucigenia was covered in defensive spines and walked on stilt-like legs, so bizarre that scientists spent decades trying to figure out which end was its head. Some animals from this period had body plans that were evolutionary dead ends, experiments in living that worked for a time, but ultimately led nowhere. They represent paths not taken, reminders that evolution is not a straight line toward complexity, but a branching tree with many limbs that bear no fruit. Yet among these strange creatures were the ancestors of everything familiar in today's world. Your own lineage traces back to a tiny, worm-like creature called Pikaia, one of the earliest animals with something resembling a backbone. It was unremarkable among the Cambrian menagerie, yet it carried within its simple body the blueprint that would eventually give rise to all vertebrate life. The Cambrian explosion taught life some of its most important lessons. It established predation as a driving force of evolution, proved that hard shells and protective structures could be effective survival strategies, and demonstrated that complex sensory systems like eyes could provide enormous advantages to their owners. Most remarkably, this burst of creativity happened in just 20 million years, an eye blink in geological time. It was as if evolution had been saving up its creative energy for eons and then released it all at once in a festival of biological innovation that has never been equaled. The trilobites that emerged from this creative explosion would become one of the most successful groups of animals ever to live. They survived for over 270 million years, adapting to every marine environment and developing thousands of different species. Their sophisticated eyes, jointed legs, and segmented bodies established design principles that arthropods still use today. 450 million years ago, life faced one of its greatest challenges yet. For over 3 billion years, every living thing had called the oceans home. The land surface of Earth was a barren, lifeless wasteland, scorched by ultraviolet radiation and scoured by harsh weather. But now, life was ready to leave the safety of the seas and colonize the vast emptiness of the continents. The pioneers of this great migration were not animals, but plants and fungi. These humble organisms had to solve problems that no life form had ever faced before. On land, there was no water to provide buoyancy, no dissolved nutrients to absorb, and no protection from the sun's deadly radiation. Everything about terrestrial existence required new solutions. The first land plants were simple, branching structures without true roots, stems, or leaves. They looked more like green felt spread across the rocks than the towering trees we know today. Yet these modest pioneers were revolutionaries, the first complex life forms to establish a foothold in the alien environment of dry land. They formed partnerships with fungi, creating some of Earth's first cooperative ventures between different kingdoms of life. The fungi helped the plants absorb water and nutrients from the primitive soils, while the plants shared the sugars they made through photosynthesis. Together, they began the slow process of creating the first true soils, transforming barren rock into the rich foundation that would support all future terrestrial life. The early land plants had to invent entirely new technologies for terrestrial survival. They developed waxy coatings to prevent water loss, structural supports to hold themselves upright against gravity, and root systems to anchor themselves and absorb water from the ground. Most importantly, they invented lignin, the complex polymer that we call wood, which allowed them to build tall, strong structures that could compete for sunlight. The first animals to follow the plants onto land were arthropods, creatures related to modern insects and spiders. Some of these early pioneers were giants by today's standards. Millipedes grew to 8 feet in length, scuttling through the primitive forests like living logs. They fed on decaying plant matter and helped create the first terrestrial food webs. These early land animals had to completely reimagine their sensory systems. In water, they had used lateral lines to detect vibrations and chemical gradients to find food and mates. On land, they had to learn to hear airborne sounds, see through air instead of water, and develop new ways to communicate across distances. The colonization of land was not a single event, but a gradual process that took millions of years. Wave after wave of organisms left the oceans, each group developing new strategies for terrestrial survival. Some succeeded and established lineages that persist today. Others failed and retreated to the water, or vanished entirely. The first forests were unlike anything in the modern world. They consisted of giant ferns, towering club mosses, and enormous horsetails that created cathedral-like spaces beneath their canopies. These plants reproduced by releasing millions of spores that drifted through the air like biological snow, a reproductive strategy that filled the ancient forests with a constant, gentle rain of potential new life. The very process of life on land began to change the planet's climate. Plants removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, gradually cooling the global temperature and creating more variable weather patterns. The roots of plants began to break down rocks more rapidly, accelerating the weathering processes that help regulate Earth's temperature over geological time. as life established itself on land, it set the stage for the next great chapter in evolution. The solid ground beneath your feet was once as lifeless as the surface of Mars. Every tree, every blade of grass, every terrestrial animal, including yourself, owes its existence to those brave pioneers who first learned to live in the harsh world above the waves. The colonization of land ushered in an age of giants. By 350 million years ago, vast swampy forests covered much of the planet, and the high oxygen levels in the atmosphere allowed life to experiment with sizes that seem almost impossible today. Dragonflies soared through humid air on wings that spanned over 2 feet, larger than many modern birds. They were the fighter jets of their era, aerial predators that could catch almost any flying prey. The oxygen-rich atmosphere, which reached 35% of the total air composition compared to 21% today, allowed these giants to exist because their simple breathing systems could extract enough oxygen to power their massive bodies. On the forest floor, spiders grew to the size of dinner plates, and millipedes reached lengths that would make them competitive with small cars. The high oxygen levels acted like a performance-enhancing drug for the entire ecosystem, allowing animals to grow to sizes that would be impossible in today's atmosphere. The forests themselves were magnificent and alien. Giant club mosses stretched over 100 feet into the sky, their trunks as wide as redwoods, but their leaves arranged in spiral patterns that cast shifting shadows across the swampy ground. Enormous horsetails formed dense thickets, and tree-sized ferns created a canopy so thick that the forest floor remained in perpetual twilight. These were the coal forests, and their remains form most of the coal deposits we burn today. When these giant plants died, they often fell into oxygen-poor swamps where they couldn't fully decompose. Instead, they were buried and compressed over millions of years, storing the ancient sunlight they had captured in carbon-rich deposits that would power human civilization billions of years later. The sound of these forests would have been dominated by the buzzing and humming of countless insects. Without birds or mammals to provide complex songs, the acoustic landscape was filled with the drone of giant mayflies, the clicking of enormous beetles, and the rustle of wind through primitive leaves. The first amphibians appeared during this time, four-legged creatures that still had to return to the water to lay their eggs. Some of these early amphibians were surprisingly large, reaching lengths of 15 feet or more. They had 8 toes on their front feet, a number that seems random, but proved to be important for providing stability on land. Many of these amphibians retained fish-like characteristics, with lateral lines for detecting water movement and gill slits that they used for breathing underwater. They represented evolution's first serious attempts to create vertebrate animals that could live both in water and on land. The high oxygen levels that allowed these giants to exist also created a world where fire was a constant danger. Even damp wood could ignite spontaneously, and wildfires could burn with an intensity unknown in the modern world. The forests existed in a delicate balance between the lush growth promoted by high oxygen and the constant threat of conflagration. This was an experimental world, a time when life was testing the limits of what was possible in an oxygen-rich environment. Many of the evolutionary solutions developed during this period would prove to be temporary, successful only under the unique atmospheric conditions of the time. When oxygen levels eventually declined, the age of giants would end, but the memory of their existence would be preserved in the fossil record as a reminder of life's incredible versatility. 320 million years ago, life achieved one of its most important innovations. For the first time, vertebrate animals learned to reproduce entirely on land, freeing themselves completely from dependence on water for their life cycles. The key to this revolution was the evolution of the amniotic egg, a remarkable biological package that contained everything a developing embryo needed to survive in the terrestrial environment. These eggs were equipped with a tough, leathery shell that prevented water loss while still allowing oxygen to pass through. Inside, a complex system of membranes created different compartments for the growing embryo, its food supply, and its waste products. The amniotic egg was such a successful innovation that every land vertebrate, including you, still develops within the same basic membrane system. Even though mammals no longer lay eggs, human embryos still develop surrounded by amniotic fluid, protected by the same membranes that first evolved in those ancient reptilian eggs. The first reptiles looked remarkably similar to modern lizards, but their impact on the future of life was enormous. They could lay their eggs on dry land, dig burrows for protection, and develop waterproof skin that prevented dehydration. For the first time, vertebrates were truly independent of aquatic environments. These early reptiles quickly diversified into an amazing variety of forms. Some developed large sails on their backs for temperature regulation, using these solar collectors to warm their blood in the morning, and cooling fins to prevent overheating during the day. Dimetrodon, often mistaken for a dinosaur in popular culture, was actually more closely related to mammals, and represented one of the first attempts by vertebrates to actively control their body temperature. The amniotic revolution coincided with the formation of the supercontinent Pangaea, which brought together previously isolated land masses and allowed new evolutionary experiments to spread across vast areas. Animals that had evolved in one region could now migrate to distant continents, leading to increased competition and rapid diversification. The development of amniotic reproduction also required improvements in other systems. These animals needed better ways to hear airborne sounds rather than waterborne vibrations, more sophisticated methods of temperature regulation, and enhanced kidneys that could conserve water in the terrestrial environment. Some reptiles became the first large herbivorous vertebrates, developing complex teeth and jaw mechanisms that could process tough plant material. This created entirely new ecological relationships as plants and plant-eating animals began an evolutionary arms race that would shape terrestrial ecosystems for hundreds of millions of years. The amniotic egg represented more than just a reproductive innovation. It was a declaration of independence from the aquatic world that had nurtured life for over 3 billion years. With this single evolutionary breakthrough, vertebrates gained access to all the terrestrial environments of Earth, from deserts to mountaintops to polar regions. The reptiles that emerged from this innovation would go on to dominate the planet for the next 200 million years. They would evolve into creatures as diverse as tiny lizards and enormous dinosaurs, flying pterosaurs and swimming plesiosaurs. The age of reptiles was about to begin, and it would reshape life on Earth in ways that still influence our world today. The success of early reptiles also set the stage for the evolution of the first true mammals, animals that would remain small and hidden for millions of years, but would eventually inherit the Earth and give rise to creatures capable of contemplating their own evolutionary history. 252 million years ago, Earth experienced the worst catastrophe in the history of life. The Permian-Triassic extinction, sometimes called the Great Dying, came closer to ending life on our planet than any event before or since. 96% of marine species and 70% of land species simply vanished, leaving behind a world so devastated that it took 10 million years for ecosystems to fully recover. The cause of this near apocalypse was volcanism on a scale difficult to imagine. In what is now Siberia, enormous volcanic eruptions continued for thousands of years, covering an area larger than the continental United States, with layers of lava over a mile thick. These weren't ordinary eruptions, but massive outpourings of molten rock that released vast quantities of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The climate effects were catastrophic. Global temperatures rose by more than 10 degrees Celsius, turning the oceans into hot, acidic seas where temperatures reached over 40 degrees Celsius, too hot for most marine life to survive. The chemistry of the oceans changed so dramatically that vast regions became completely oxygen-free, creating underwater deserts where nothing could live. On land, the situation was equally dire. Acid rain fell from skies choked with volcanic ash and toxic gases. The elevated temperatures made many regions uninhabitable, and the disruption of weather patterns caused droughts and floods that destroyed terrestrial ecosystems across the globe. For a brief period, fungi dominated the earth as they fed on the remains of dead plants and animals. The fossil record from this time shows a world where decomposers had temporarily taken over, breaking down the organic matter left behind by the mass extinction and recycling it back into simpler compounds. Only one large predator species survived the extinction on land, and it took millions of years for complex food webs to re-establish themselves. The mammal-like reptiles that had dominated terrestrial ecosystems before the extinction were almost completely wiped out, leaving ecological niches empty and waiting for new groups to evolve and fill them. The recovery from the Great Dying was slow, but ultimately transformative. The empty world left behind by the extinction became a laboratory for evolution, allowing surviving groups to experiment with new ways of life and diversify into forms that would never have been possible in the crowded ecosystems that existed before. It was during this recovery period that the first dinosaurs appeared, small bipedal creatures that initially seemed unremarkable among the other reptiles struggling to rebuild the terrestrial ecosystem. But these humble beginnings would eventually lead to the most successful group of large land animals in Earth's history. The Great Dying also marked the end of many evolutionary experiments that had been running for hundreds of millions of years. Entire groups of animals that had survived previous extinctions finally disappeared, taking with them unique solutions to the challenges of life that would never be tried again. The extinction served as a reset button for life on Earth, clearing away established ecosystems and allowing entirely new biological communities to emerge. The world that recovered from the Great Dying was fundamentally different from the one that had existed before, setting the stage for the age of dinosaurs, and ultimately for the evolution of mammals and the eventual emergence of human consciousness. This ancient catastrophe reminds us how fragile life can be, even on a planetary scale. Yet it also demonstrates life's remarkable resilience and creativity. From the ashes of the worst extinction in Earth's history would arise some of the most magnificent creatures ever to walk the planet. 230 million years ago, in the aftermath of the Great Dying, a new group of reptiles began to make their mark on the recovering world. These were the first dinosaurs, and though they started small and unremarkable, they would eventually become the most successful large land animals in Earth's history. The earliest dinosaurs were only about the size of chickens, bipedal creatures that walked upright on long, slender legs. They were probably warm-blooded, covered in simple feathers for insulation, and possessed many of the characteristics that would make their descendants so successful. Their hollow bones made them lighter and more agile than their competitors, and their upright posture allowed them to move more efficiently than the sprawling reptiles that dominated the landscape. At the same time, the first mammals were also evolving, but they remained tiny, shrew-like creatures that lived in the shadows of the larger reptiles. These early mammals were mostly nocturnal, using their superior hearing and sense of smell to hunt insects and small prey in the darkness while avoiding the dinosaurs and other reptiles that dominated the daylight hours. The early Triassic world was still recovering from the Great Extinction, and the climate was hot and dry over much of the planet. The first conifers were beginning to form true forests, replacing the primitive trees that had dominated earlier periods. These new forests provided habitat for the evolving dinosaur communities and created more complex ecosystems than had existed immediately after the extinction. The dinosaurs of this period were already experimenting with different lifestyles. Some remained small, agile predators, while others began to explore herbivory, developing the complex digestive systems necessary to extract nutrition from tough plant material. The first long-necked dinosaurs appeared, though they were much smaller than the giants they would eventually become. Competition between different groups of reptiles was intense during this period. Dinosaurs had to compete with crocodile relatives, early mammals, and other archosaurs for food and territory. The flying reptiles, called pterosaurs, also evolved during this time, becoming the first vertebrates to achieve powered flight and opening up entirely new ecological possibilities. The early dinosaurs showed remarkable intelligence for reptiles, with complex social behaviors and sophisticated parenting strategies. Some species lived in herds, others built elaborate nests, and many showed evidence of caring for their young long after hatching. These behaviors would become hallmarks of dinosaur success throughout their long reign. The first dinosaurs were likely capable of seeing in color, and may have been brilliantly colored themselves, using visual displays for communication and mate selection. Their excellent color vision, inherited from their archosaur ancestors, would prove advantageous in the complex visual environment of the evolving forests. As the Triassic period progressed, dinosaurs gradually began to outcompete their rivals and establish themselves as the dominant group of large land animals. Their success was based on a combination of physiological advantages, behavioral flexibility, and perhaps most importantly, their ability to adapt quickly to changing environmental conditions. The split between the two main dinosaur groups, the Ornithischians and Saurischians, occurred very early in their evolutionary history, setting up the basic body plan differences that would characterize dinosaurs for the next 165 million years. This early diversification proved to be one of the keys to their long-term success. By the end of the Triassic period, dinosaurs had established themselves as a force to be reckoned with. But their greatest achievements still lay ahead. The stage was set for the golden age of giants that would make dinosaurs the most famous extinct animals in the world. For over 150 million years, from roughly 200 to 66 million years ago, dinosaurs ruled the earth with a diversity and magnificence that has never been equaled by any other group of large land animals. This was the golden age of giants, when the planet hosted creatures so enormous and spectacular that they continue to capture our imagination today. The sauropods were perhaps the most awe-inspiring of all dinosaurs. These long-necked giants grew to lengths exceeding 100 feet and weights approaching 100 tons, making them the largest land animals that have ever lived. Creatures like Argentinosaurus and Dreadnoughtus were living skyscrapers, their heads reaching heights equivalent to a 4-story building as they browsed on the tops of ancient trees. These giants achieved their enormous size through remarkable biological innovations. Their bones were hollow, filled with air sacs like those of modern birds, making them much lighter than solid bone would have allowed. Their long necks were marvels of engineering, composed of dozens of vertebrae that worked together like a biological crane to reach food sources that other animals couldn't access. At the other end of the size spectrum were predators like Allosaurus and eventually Tyrannosaurus rex, creatures that redefined what it meant to be a terrestrial carnivore. T-Rex possessed a bite force of 57,000 pounds per square inch, powerful enough to crush the bones of its prey with ease. Its massive skull, over 5 feet long, housed a brain that was surprisingly sophisticated, with excellent vision, hearing, and spatial reasoning abilities. But dinosaurs were far more than just giants. They occupied every conceivable ecological niche, from tiny feathered dinosaurs the size of hummingbirds to heavily armored herbivores like Ankylosaurus that resembled living tanks. Some dinosaurs were social creatures that lived in vast herds, migrating across continents in search of food and suitable nesting sites. Dinosaur reproduction was remarkably sophisticated. They built elaborate nests, with some species creating communal nesting grounds that hosted hundreds of breeding pairs. Their eggs came in a variety of colors, including blues and greens, and many species showed extensive parental care, protecting and feeding their young for months or even years after hatching. Many dinosaurs were brilliantly colored, using their vibrant plumage for communication, courtship displays, and species recognition. Some may have been capable of complex vocalizations, singing to each other across the ancient landscapes like birds do today. The discovery of fossilized feathers has revealed that dinosaur coloration could be as diverse and beautiful as that of modern tropical birds. The world during the age of dinosaurs was dramatically different from today. Global temperatures were much warmer, with no polar ice caps and sea levels hundreds of feet higher than at present. Lush forests extended to the poles, and the climate was so mild that dinosaurs lived comfortably in Antarctica, which was still connected to other southern continents. Flying reptiles, called pterosaurs, ruled the skies, with some species achieving wingspans of over 35 feet, making them the largest flying animals that have ever lived. In the oceans, marine reptiles like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs filled the ecological roles now occupied by whales and dolphins. The dinosaurs shared their world with early mammals, but these remained small and largely nocturnal throughout the entire age of dinosaurs. Some early mammals were no larger than shrews, living in the shadows and crevices of a world dominated by giants. Flowering plants evolved during the later part of the dinosaur age, creating new types of forests and establishing the intimate relationships between plants and pollinators that characterize modern ecosystems. Many dinosaurs adapted to feed on these new plants, developing increasingly sophisticated teeth and digestive systems. The success of dinosaurs lasted for over 3 times longer than mammals have existed, making them one of the most successful groups of animals in Earth's history. Their reign seemed secure, their dominance absolute. Nothing in their evolutionary experience had prepared them for what was coming from space. 66 million years ago, the golden age of dinosaurs came to a sudden and catastrophic end. A 6-mile-wide asteroid, traveling at over 40,000 miles per hour, slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico with the force of billions of nuclear weapons. In an instant, the world that dinosaurs had dominated for over 150 million years was transformed into an alien landscape of darkness and death. The impact itself was beyond imagination. It created a crater 93 miles wide and 12 miles deep, vaporizing the asteroid and vast quantities of Earth's crust in a fireball that briefly rivaled the sun in brightness. The explosion sent debris flying at such tremendous velocities that rocks from the impact site have been found on every continent on Earth. The immediate effects were catastrophic. A massive tsunami, potentially over a mile high, swept across the Americas. Earthquakes stronger than any in recorded history shook the entire planet. But these initial disasters were just the beginning of a global catastrophe that would reshape life on Earth. The impact ejected so much debris into the atmosphere that it blocked out the sun for months or possibly years. The world was plunged into an impact winter, darker than the deepest night. Temperatures plummeted as photosynthesis ceased, and the food chains that had supported the dinosaurs collapsed from the bottom up. In the darkness and cold, the giants were the first to go. Large animals require enormous amounts of food, and when plant life died and herbivorous dinosaurs starved, the carnivores that depended on them quickly followed. Only the smallest animals, those that could survive on seeds, insects, and detritus, managed to endure the long darkness. The extinction was swift, but not instantaneous. Some dinosaurs may have survived for thousands of years after the initial impact, clinging to life in isolated refuges where conditions remained marginally habitable. But eventually, the combination of climate change, habitat destruction, and ecosystem collapse proved too much even for these resilient survivors. Yet the extinction was not complete. One group of dinosaurs managed to survive the catastrophe. The birds, which are actually living dinosaurs, made it through the impact winter and eventually diversified to fill many of the ecological niches left empty by their extinct relatives. Every bird you see today is a direct descendant of the dinosaurs that ruled the Mesozoic world. The small mammals that had lived in the shadows of the dinosaurs were among the survivors. Their small size, warm blood, and ability to eat almost anything helped them endure the harsh post-impact conditions. When the skies finally cleared and plant life began to recover, these modest creatures found themselves inheriting a world from which their giant competitors had vanished. The impact that ended the age of dinosaurs killed approximately 75% of all species on Earth, but it also created opportunities for the survivors. With the dominant large animals gone, evolution was free to experiment with new forms and lifestyles. The stage was set for the age of mammals to begin. This ancient catastrophe reminds us how quickly and dramatically life can change. The dinosaurs had seemed invincible, masters of their world for millions of times, longer than humans have existed. Yet they were vulnerable to forces beyond their control, cosmic accidents that could reshape the entire biosphere in a matter of years. The extinction of the non-bird dinosaurs was one of the most significant events in the history of life, clearing the way for the rise of mammals and ultimately making possible the evolution of human consciousness. In a sense, we owe our existence to that ancient cosmic collision that ended one chapter of life's story and began another. 66 million years ago, in the aftermath of the Great Catastrophe, small mammals emerged from their underground refuges into a changed world. The giants were gone, the skies were clearing, and for the first time in over 150 million years, mammals had an opportunity to explore ecological niches that had been dominated by dinosaurs. These early mammals were not impressive by modern standards. Most were no larger than rats or small cats, with simple teeth and generalized body plans that allowed them to eat almost anything they could find. But they possessed several crucial advantages that would serve them well in the post-extinction world. They were warm-blooded, covered in insulating fur, and capable of rapid reproduction. Most importantly, they were behaviorally flexible, able to adapt quickly to new environments and food sources. The diversification of mammals after the extinction was remarkably rapid. Within just 10 million years, mammals had evolved to fill most of the major ecological roles that had been vacated by the dinosaurs. Some became browsers, others grazers, and still others evolved into predators capable of hunting large prey. But the early age of mammals was also a time of evolutionary experimentation that produced some truly bizarre creatures. Some early mammals evolved to enormous sizes. One species of beaver grew to be larger than a small car, and early elephants were actually quite small, standing only about 2 feet tall at the shoulder. Perhaps most remarkably, some mammals that had evolved to live on land decided to return to the water. The ancestors of whales were 4-legged, wolf-like creatures that gradually adapted to aquatic life over millions of years. They developed increasingly streamlined bodies, their legs transformed into flippers, and their nostrils migrated to the tops of their heads to become blowholes. The first horses were tiny creatures about the size of house cats, with multiple toes on each foot rather than the single hoof of modern horses. They lived in forests and fed on soft leaves rather than grass, which hadn't yet become widespread across the planet. Flying mammals also evolved during this period. The first bats appeared and quickly mastered powered flight, becoming the only mammals ever to achieve true flight, rather than just gliding. Some bats evolved echolocation, using sound waves to navigate and hunt in complete darkness, a biological sonar system that rivals any technology humans have developed. The early mammals developed complex social behaviors and sophisticated methods of caring for their young. Unlike reptiles, which generally abandon their offspring after laying eggs, mammals invested heavily in parental care, nursing their young with milk, and teaching them essential survival skills. The grasslands that would come to dominate much of the planet's land surface first appeared during this period, creating entirely new ecosystems that many mammals quickly learned to exploit. The evolution of grasses created opportunities for large herds of grazing animals, which in turn supported populations of predators and scavengers. Early primates also appeared during this time, small tree-dwelling creatures with forward-facing eyes and grasping hands that were well suited to life in the forest canopy. These modest ancestors would eventually give rise to all the primates, including the lineage that would lead to humans. The mammals of this era also had to contend with some formidable predators. Giant, flightless birds, descendants of the dinosaurs, ruled some ecosystems as apex predators, hunting mammals with powerful legs and massive beaks. For several million years after the asteroid impact, birds were actually the dominant large predators on land. The success of mammals during this period set the stage for all future mammalian evolution. The basic body plans and ecological strategies developed during the early age of mammals continue to characterize mammalian life today. From tiny shrews to enormous whales, from burrowing moles to flying bats. The mammals that emerged from the post-extinction world explored nearly every possible way of being a warm-blooded, furry vertebrate. 55 million years ago, among the diverse mammals inheriting the post-dinosaur world, a group of small, tree-dwelling creatures began to develop characteristics that would prove revolutionary. These were the early primates, and their innovations in vision, dexterity, and intelligence would eventually lead to the evolution of consciousness itself. The first primates were modest creatures, about the size of modern shrews, with long snouts and claws rather than the fingernails we associate with primates today. But they possessed several key innovations that set them apart from other mammals. Most importantly, they had forward-facing eyes that provided stereoscopic vision, allowing them to judge distances accurately as they leaped between branches in the forest canopy. The evolution of color vision was perhaps the most significant development in early primate evolution. While most mammals see the world in shades of blue and yellow, primates evolved the ability to distinguish reds and greens, probably to help them identify ripe fruits among the forest leaves. This enhanced color vision opened up new food sources and may have driven the development of larger, more complex brains. Early primates also evolved grasping hands with opposable thumbs, allowing them to manipulate objects with a precision that no other mammals could match. They replaced their claws with fingernails, providing better grip while protecting the sensitive fingertips that contained dense concentrations of touch receptors. The social lives of early primates were becoming increasingly complex. They lived in groups where individuals had to navigate complicated relationships, remember the social status of dozens of group members, and form alliances that could shift over time. This social complexity may have been one of the driving forces behind the evolution of larger brains and enhanced intelligence. Grooming became an important social behavior among early primates, serving not just to remove parasites, but to strengthen social bonds and establish hierarchies. The time spent in mutual grooming was essentially the beginning of primate politics, a way for individuals to maintain relationships and negotiate their place in the group. Some early primates developed prehensile tails that functioned as a fifth limb, allowing them to hang from branches while using both hands to gather food. Others evolved specialized digestive systems that allowed them to extract nutrition from leaves, expanding their dietary options beyond fruits and insects. The split between Old World and New World primates occurred about 40 million years ago, when changing sea levels and continental drift separated the primate populations of Africa and South America. These two groups would evolve independently for millions of years, developing different solutions to the challenges of arboreal life. Early primates had to contend with formidable predators, including giant birds of prey that could snatch them from the treetops, and large carnivorous mammals that hunted in the forest understory. The constant threat of predation favored primates that were alert, intelligent, and capable of rapid escape through the trees. The brain size of early primates was gradually increasing, not just in absolute terms, but relative to their body size. This trend toward encephalization would continue throughout primate evolution, eventually leading to the extraordinary cognitive abilities that characterize modern primates, especially humans. Some early primate species developed the ability to see well in low light conditions, allowing them to be active during dawn and dusk when many of their predators were less active. Others remained strictly diurnal, taking advantage of the full spectrum of color vision that daylight provided. The success of early primates was intimately connected to the success of flowering plants and the fruits they produced. As forests became more diverse and productive, they provided the resources necessary to support larger primate populations and more complex social structures. These early primates were laying the foundation for all future primate evolution. Their emphasis on vision over smell, manual dexterity over specialized locomotion, and social intelligence over individual survival strategies would characterize the entire primate lineage, and ultimately make possible the evolution of human culture and technology. 7 million years ago, in the wooded grasslands of Africa, our own story truly begins. The human lineage diverged from our closest ape relatives and began the remarkable journey that would lead from tree-dwelling primates to space-exploring humans in just a few million years. The early human ancestors, or hominids, faced a changing world. The climate was becoming drier, and the dense forests that had supported their ape-like ancestors were giving way to more open woodlands and grasslands. This environmental change created both challenges and opportunities that would shape human evolution for millions of years. One of the most significant adaptations of early hominids was the evolution of bipedalism, the ability to walk upright on two legs. This may seem like a simple change, but it required extensive modifications to the skeleton, muscle system, and nervous system. The pelvis had to be redesigned to support the body's weight over 2 legs instead of 4. The spine developed its characteristic S-curve to maintain balance, and the leg bones became longer and stronger. Lucy, one of our most famous early ancestors, lived about 3.2 million years ago and stood only about 3 feet tall. Despite her small stature, she could walk upright across the African landscape, though she was still an excellent climber and probably spent considerable time in the trees. Her kind represented a transitional form between the fully arboreal apes and the fully terrestrial humans that would evolve later. The advantages of bipedalism are still debated by scientists, but it likely served multiple functions. Walking upright freed the hands for carrying food, tools, and infants across longer distances. It also allowed early hominids to see over tall grass and spot both predators and prey from greater distances. Perhaps most importantly, it was more energy efficient for traveling long distances across open terrain. The early human brain was still quite small, similar in size to that of modern chimpanzees, but it was beginning to show signs of the reorganization that would characterize later human evolution. The areas associated with tool use and social cognition were starting to expand, even though overall brain size remained modest. Tool use among early hominids was probably limited to simple implements like sticks for digging and stones for cracking nuts. But even these basic technologies represented a significant advance over the tool use of other primates. The ability to modify objects to make them more useful was a crucial step toward the complex technology that would eventually characterize human civilization. Social cooperation was becoming increasingly important for early hominids. Living in open environments with limited tree cover for escape meant that group members had to work together to defend against predators and find food across scattered resources. This cooperation required enhanced communication abilities and more sophisticated social structures. The diet of early hominids was probably quite varied, including fruits, nuts, tubers, and occasionally meat from scavenged carcasses. Their teeth show adaptations for processing tough, fibrous plant materials, but they lacked the specialized carnivorous adaptations of dedicated meat eaters. Several different species of early hominids existed simultaneously, representing different evolutionary experiments in how to be a bipedal ape. Some, like the robust Australopithecines, developed massive jaws and teeth for processing tough plant foods. Others, like the gracile Australopithecines that would eventually lead to humans, maintained smaller, more generalized teeth that could handle a more varied diet. The ability to throw objects accurately was emerging as a unique human trait during this period. While many animals can throw things, humans developed an accuracy and power in throwing that no other species has matched. This ability would prove crucial for both hunting and defense. The early hominids were still quite vulnerable to predation, and many fossils show evidence of attacks by large cats, hyenas, and birds of prey. Living successfully in open environments required constant vigilance and the development of strategies for avoiding or defending against predators. These early chapters of human evolution were setting the stage for the dramatic changes that would come later. The basic adaptations for terrestrial life were being established. The foundation for tool use was being laid. And the social and cognitive abilities that would distinguish humans from all other animals were beginning to emerge. 300,000 years ago, in the highlands of Africa, a new kind of human appeared that would prove to be unlike anything the world had ever seen. Homo sapiens, our own species, emerged with brains nearly 3 times larger than our early ancestors and cognitive abilities that would soon transform not just human society, but the entire planet. These early modern humans looked essentially like us. They had the same basic anatomy, the same potential for complex thought and language, and the same capacity for creativity and innovation that characterizes our species today. Yet their lives were still governed by the ancient rhythms of hunting and gathering that had sustained human ancestors for millions of years. The most remarkable feature of early humans was their dramatically enlarged brain. At around 1,400 cubic centimeters, the human brain was not just larger than that of earlier hominids, but it was organized differently, with expanded areas devoted to language, abstract thinking, and complex planning. Paradoxically, this brain was actually slightly larger than the average modern human brain, suggesting that intelligence may have been even more crucial for survival in the challenging environments of the past. The invention of cooking may have been one of the key factors that allowed such large brains to evolve. Cooking food makes nutrients more available and easier to digest, freeing up energy that could be invested in brain growth and maintenance. The control of fire also extended the day, allowing humans to remain active after dark and creating opportunities for more complex social interactions. Language was perhaps the most revolutionary development in human evolution. While other animals communicate, human language is unique in its complexity, flexibility, and ability to convey abstract concepts. Language allowed humans to share detailed information about the environment, coordinate complex group activities, and most importantly, pass knowledge from one generation to the next. The first art appeared around 40,000 years ago, with cave paintings and carved figurines that demonstrate not just technical skill, but genuine aesthetic sensibility. These early artists were creating images not for survival, but for expression, showing that humans had developed the capacity for symbolic thought and creative imagination. Humans were also developing increasingly sophisticated tools, not just for immediate use, but for making other tools. This recursive technology, tools to make tools, represented a cognitive breakthrough that no other species has achieved. Spear throwers increased hunting range, sewing needles allowed for better clothing, and carefully crafted blades could be used for dozens of different tasks. The social organization of early humans was becoming remarkably complex. They lived in groups of 50 to 150 individuals, maintaining relationships and keeping track of social obligations across extended networks of family and alliance. This required sophisticated memory and social intelligence that pushed the limits of cognitive capacity. Humans almost went extinct around 70,000 years ago, possibly due to climate changes associated with a massive volcanic eruption. Genetic evidence suggests that the entire human population may have been reduced to as few as 10,000 individuals, a bottleneck so severe that it left permanent marks on our genetic diversity. Every human alive today descends from the small population that survived this near extinction event. The expansion of humans out of Africa and across the globe was one of the most remarkable migrations in the history of life. Using boats they built themselves, humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago. They walked across the Bering Land Bridge to populate the Americas, adapted to the Ice Age conditions of Europe, and eventually colonized every continent except Antarctica. Wherever humans went, they brought change. Large mammals that had never encountered human hunters often went extinct shortly after human arrival. Humans were learning to actively modify their environments through fire, creating grasslands and park-like forests that supported their preferred prey species. The development of burial practices and apparent concern for the dead suggests that humans were grappling with abstract concepts like mortality and the meaning of existence. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of flower burials, indicating that even our extinct human relatives had developed complex attitudes toward death and loss. Humans were also developing the first musical instruments, with flutes carved from bone that are over 40,000 years old. Music, like art, serves no obvious survival function, but demonstrates the human capacity for creating beauty and meaning beyond the basic requirements of existence. The story of early modern humans is remarkable not just for what they achieved, but for how quickly they achieved it. In less than 300,000 years, humans went from being just another species of African ape to the dominant force shaping life on Earth. This acceleration was possible because humans had learned to accumulate and build upon knowledge, creating culture that could evolve much faster than biology. 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age, humans made a discovery that would change everything. In scattered locations around the world, people began to notice that the wild plants they gathered could be encouraged to grow in specific places, that certain varieties produced better food than others, and that careful selection and tending could dramatically increase the productivity of the land. This was the beginning of agriculture, and it represented one of the most significant transitions in human history. For over 2 million years, humans had lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across the landscape in small groups and taking what nature provided. Now, for the first time, humans were actively creating their food supply domesticating plants and animals, and fundamentally altering the ecosystems around them. The agricultural revolution began independently in at least 7 different regions around the world. In the Middle East, people domesticated wheat, barley, and legumes. In China, rice and millet became the foundation crops. In Mesoamerica, corn, beans, and squash formed the agricultural trinity that would support complex civilizations for thousands of years. The process of domestication was gradual and probably unconscious at first. Humans simply saved seeds from the best plants, and gradually, over many generations, these crops became larger, more nutritious, and more dependent on human care. Wild grasses with tiny, hard seeds slowly transformed into wheat and rice with large, soft grains that could feed entire populations. Animal domestication followed a similar pattern. Dogs were probably the first domesticated animals, descendants of wolves that learned to live with humans over 15,000 years ago. Sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs followed, providing not just meat, but milk, wool, leather, and labor. The effects of agriculture were profound and irreversible. For the first time in human history, people could stay in one place year-round, building permanent settlement that grew into villages and eventually cities. The ability to store surplus food allowed some people to specialize in activities other than food production, leading to the development of crafts, trade, and eventually science and art. But agriculture also came with costs. Early farmers were actually less healthy than hunter-gatherers, with evidence of malnutrition, infectious diseases, and reduced life expectancy. The concentration of people in permanent settlements created ideal conditions for the spread of diseases, and the reliance on a few crop species made populations vulnerable to famine when those crops failed. Agriculture also led to increased social inequality. The ability to accumulate and store surplus food created wealth differences that had never existed in hunter-gatherer societies. Some individuals and families gained control over land and resources, leading to the emergence of social classes and hierarchical societies. The invention of the plow revolutionized agriculture by allowing farmers to cultivate much larger areas with less labor. Oxen and horses were harnessed to pull these implements, dramatically increasing agricultural productivity and freeing even more people to pursue specialized occupations. Writing systems were invented to keep track of agricultural surpluses, trade transactions, and tax obligations. The earliest known writing consists of simple tallies and inventories, practical records of who owed what to whom. But writing quickly expanded to include laws, stories, and religious texts, creating the first permanent records of human thought and culture. The agricultural revolution allowed human populations to grow from a few million hunter-gatherers to hundreds of millions of farmers and city dwellers. This population explosion was possible only because agriculture could produce much more food per unit of land than hunting and gathering, though it required much more work per unit of food produced. Trade networks began to span continents as agricultural surpluses allowed some regions to specialize in particular crops or crafts. Ideas, technologies, and diseases spread along these trade routes, accelerating the pace of cultural change and creating the first truly global connections between human societies. The domestication of horses around 5,000 years ago revolutionized transportation and warfare, allowing rapid communication across vast distances and enabling nomadic peoples to challenge the agricultural civilizations that had seemed securely established. 5,000 years ago, in river valleys around the world, human society achieved a new level of complexity that we call civilization. Cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants rose from the Mesopotamian plains, the Nile Valley, the Indus River Basin, and the Yellow River in China. These early civilizations represented a new form of human organization that would reshape the world. The first cities were marvels of planning and engineering. Ur, Babylon, and other Mesopotamian cities featured massive walls, elaborate temple complexes, and sophisticated water management systems. The Indus Valley cities of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro had advanced sewage systems and standardized weights and measures that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. Writing evolved from simple record-keeping to complex literature and law. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's first great literary works, explored themes of friendship, mortality, and the meaning of life that still resonate today. The Code of Hammurabi established written laws that applied equally to all citizens, a revolutionary concept that laid the foundation for all future legal systems. The first libraries were established in ancient Mesopotamia, with thousands of clay tablets containing everything from epic poetry to mathematical treatises to beer recipes. These libraries preserved human knowledge and made it available to future generations, accelerating the pace of intellectual development. Mathematics and astronomy flourished in early civilizations. The Babylonians developed sophisticated mathematical systems, including place-value notation and early algebra. They tracked the movements of planets and could predict eclipses with remarkable accuracy. The Egyptians built the pyramids using precise geometric principles that required advanced understanding of mathematics and engineering. The wheel, invented around 5,500 years ago, was initially used for pottery making, but was quickly adapted for transportation. Wheeled vehicles revolutionized trade and warfare, allowing goods and armies to move much faster and farther than ever before. Metallurgy advanced from simple copper working to bronze and eventually iron, each advance providing stronger tools and weapons that gave technological advantages to the societies that mastered them. The Bronze Age and Iron Age represent major technological transitions that reshaped human society. Paper was invented in China around 2,000 years ago, but took nearly 1,000 years to reach Europe. This delay illustrates how slowly technological innovations spread in the ancient world, despite the existence of trade networks spanning continents. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, caused an explosion in literacy and learning that transformed European society. Books that had once taken months to copy by hand could now be produced in thousands of copies, making knowledge available to ordinary people for the first time in history. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries established the modern scientific method and began the systematic study of the natural world. Galileo's telescope revealed that Earth was not the center of the universe. Newton's laws explained the motion of planets and falling apples alike, and careful observation and experimentation became the foundation for understanding reality. The Industrial Revolution, powered by fossil fuels, began just 250 years ago, but has transformed human society more rapidly than any previous change in history. Steam engines, factories, and mechanized transportation allowed humans to harness energy on scales that had never been possible before. Human population has grown from perhaps 10 million at the beginning of agriculture to over 8 billion today. This population explosion has been made possible by advances in medicine, agriculture, and technology that have dramatically reduced mortality rates and increased food production. The pace of change has been accelerating throughout human history. More scientific discoveries have been made in the last century than in all previous centuries combined. The Internet has connected more humans than ever before in history, creating a global network for sharing information and ideas that spans the entire planet. Today, humans have the power to alter Earth's climate, drive species extinct, and even modify our own genetic code. We have become a geological force comparable to volcanoes and glaciers, reshaping the planet's surface and atmosphere through our activities. The story of life on Earth has led to this moment, to you, resting quietly and contemplating the immense journey that brought consciousness into existence. You are the current chapter in an ongoing story that began in ancient seas and will continue long into the future. Your DNA connects you to every living thing that has ever existed. The carbon in your body was forged in the nuclear furnaces of ancient stars. The oxygen you breathe was produced by countless generations of photosynthetic organisms. You are literally made of cosmic materials, assembled by the patient work of evolution over billions of years. In your consciousness, the universe has developed the ability to understand itself. Through human minds, matter has learned to contemplate its own existence, to appreciate beauty, to create art and music and literature that enriches the experience of being alive. You carry within yourself the genetic wisdom of 4 billion years of life, the accumulated experience of countless generations of ancestors who survived long enough to reproduce and pass their genes to the next generation. Every breath you take, every heartbeat, every thought represents the culmination of the longest and most unlikely story ever told. The elements that compose your body have journeyed through space and time, from the hearts of dying stars to the chemistry of ancient seas to the complexity of your living tissues. You are not separate from the natural world, but an integral part of it, a temporary arrangement of atoms that has gained the ability to wonder about its own existence. As you rest tonight, carried by a planet that has nurtured life for billions of years, remember that you are both the inheritor of this incredible legacy and a participant in its continuing story. The same forces that created the first cells, that drove the evolution of complex life, that led to consciousness itself, continue to work through you and around you. You are the universe dreaming about itself, matter organized in such a way that it can contemplate its own origins and imagine its own future. In the quiet darkness of sleep, you join the ancient rhythm that has carried life forward through deep time, from the first spark of chemistry to the endless possibility of tomorrow. The story continues with each new generation, each new discovery, each moment of wonder at the beauty and complexity of existence. You are part of something magnificent and ancient, a living link in the chain that connects the first life to whatever life may become. Sleep peacefully, knowing that you carry within yourself the history of the cosmos and the promise of the future. Dream of the vast journey that brought you here, and rest in the knowledge that you are exactly where and when you belong in this unfolding story of life on Earth. Good night.